This happened a long time ago, in 2003. At that time, I was returning from a vacation in Europe with my aunt and a cousin. It was December, and we were traveling from Rome to Florida to spend Christmas with the rest of the family. My aunt got a seat in business class while my cousin and I traveled in economy class and were placed in 2 middle seats in the middle row. At first, everything was very normal. It was a trip like any other, and everything was perfectly calm. Why would it be otherwise? However, some 4 or 5 hours later, this calm was interrupted by a rather unusual situation. I was reading the magazine and almost falling asleep when suddenly I heard a woman say the word "no" repeatedly in one of the back rows. At first, she was doing it in a low tone, almost as if she was whispering. But quickly, this one began to raise her voice and sounded very desperate. Before I could process what was happening, she was shouting almost hysterically, "No, no, don't." Quickly, a flight attendant ran over the screaming woman and pounced on the person sitting in the window seat. The first thing that came to my mind, and probably what everyone thought, is that someone was having a heart attack or a serious health problem. But now both women were practically on top of the other person, and their screams were so loud and they looked so terrified. I knew that that definitely couldn't be it. This all happened very quickly. It was a matter of seconds, although I remember it in great detail. At that moment, the passengers were looking at each other with a puzzled face, and in a way, there was like a delayed reaction from everyone. This was until my cousin jumped out of his seat, going over the person next to him, and immediately got to where the women were. After that, everyone stood up to see what was actually happening. Suddenly, he too started screaming for help and chaos ensued. Several people ran over, and suddenly, it was no longer just the passenger next to me and the stewardess, but a group of about 5 or 6 people struggling with the passenger at the window. Now I realized that it was a very tall man with dark hair and a rather bushy beard. At that moment, there was screaming and commotion throughout the plane. Passengers were struggling with the man, trying to restrain him somehow, but no one knew what was really going on. At that point, my cousin came running back to our row and told me that something very bad was happening. Then they started asking for ropes, belts, or whatever to try to restrain the passenger. Even one of the people in the back row held the man by his hair to try to keep him still. But the guy looked like a cornered wild beast, and there was no way to control him. Suddenly, I saw another person coming running with a fire extinguisher in his hand, and I panicked. My first thought was that there was a fire, and we were all going to die in the air. I can't describe how desperate it is to be in an airplane and have a situation like that happen, because there is really nothing you can do to protect your life. You have nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. You are hundreds of feet in the air and at the mercy of luck. However, when he arrived at the site of the chaos, this person handed the fire extinguisher to my cousin, and he hit the man in the window in the head, knocking him out on the seat. After that, my cousin, along with the stewardess, tied him hand and foot with some belts that some of the passengers had borrowed and secured him with safety ropes in the back of the plane. After that, I saw a stewardess carrying what looked like a small koala bag towards the back of the plane, which at the time seemed a bit strange to me, but I didn't really think much of it. The flight attendant started asking if there was a doctor on board to sedate the man, and all the people kept asking if there was a sky marshal on board as well, but no one came forward. I can't remember exactly how or when things calmed down, but eventually everyone was told to return to their seats. Some of the people who had helped restrain the man were asked to rotate to stand guard and keep an eye on him, in case he woke up and wanted to cause trouble again. So for the rest of the flight, there were always at least a few people sitting behind him or beside him to guard him. I could even see one person behind him holding him by the hair the whole time. A few minutes later, when the situation was under control, the pilot announced over the loudspeakers that we were in the middle of a security emergency. Actually, I can't quite remember exactly what he said, but I know that it was a security issue that was obviously related to the man they had just restrained, and that, for that reason, we were being diverted to Boston's Logan Airport. But then he said something that caused a lot of alarm among the passengers. The pilot warned about not knowing if this man had acted independently or if he had other allies inside the flight. "Be very attentive to the person next to you," were his words. At that point, we were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and still had about 4 or 5 hours to go before landing at our destination. From that announcement, an atmosphere of attentiveness settled in among the passengers. We were all paranoid, looking around us, trying to decipher if the person next to us was some henchman of the other man strapped in the back. However, we weren't quite clear what we were watching out for either, because no one knew exactly what was going on, who the guy was who was tied up in the back of the plane, or what his intentions really were. From then on, we were also not allowed to get up from our seats, and if you needed to do so unavoidably, to go to the bathroom, something like that, we had to call a stewardess to escort us there, and the door could not be closed. I remember a grumpy old man a few rows away from us who got very upset about this and would defy the stewardesses by getting up without permission and going to the bathroom on his own, forcing the poor things to have to stand behind him at every turn. Logically, no one on the plane was happy. We were all nervous and confused, and anxious for the moment of landing, probably with the intention of distracting the passengers from the commotion. After a while, they put on the movie Mean Girls, and the truth is that it seemed to work. It was then that my cousin and I went up to business class to talk to my aunt, and to our surprise, they did not hear the extent of the chaos on the plane. After talking to my aunt and bringing her up to speed, we returned to our seats, and now all seemed calm. Until we were approaching U.S. territory and saw out the windows a group of fighter jets flying next to us. Then the pilot announced again over the loudspeakers that the U.S. Army was escorting us back to Boston. The little kids were very excited to see the jets and would lean out of the windows to admire them, but I am a military child and knew that this was sort of a last resort when a major threat was presumed. At that time, the 9/11 attacks were still fresh, and those jets were not there to protect our safety, but the safety of the country. So if this plane was hijacked and went off course, they were supposed to shoot it down. The thought of this sent shivers down my spine, and I prayed to God that this was not the scenario, for if it was, we were all dead. From that moment on, a feeling of emptiness settled in my stomach until we finally landed at the airport. I thought that once we landed, everything would be fine and we could have a normal trip, but the nightmare was far from over yet. As soon as we landed, we were told to stay at our stations. A SWAT team came on board carrying assault rifles, bulletproof vests, and equipment I recognized as bomb-proof. That's when a shiver started to run down my back, and I realized what was possibly actually happening. The agents cut all of the man's restraints and led him out of the plane in handcuffs and heavily guarded. I saw everything in detail from where we were sitting, as we were only a few seats away from where everything was happening. We were parked in the middle of the tarmac parade for a long time before we were allowed to disembark, then escorted to a baggage claim area at the airport, which was surrounded by a large metal fence to keep us all in one place. We were there for 3 or 4 hours, and we were all too impatient. No one explained anything to us, so the passengers were very agitated, and the children were crying and shaking the metal fences, while everyone started protesting and shouting to the staff that this was inhumane treatment. No food, nowhere to sit, let us out. Younger children were crying. Dozens of people were trying to sleep on the baggage carousel. Everything had become chaotic. Finally, to calm the waters, they bought a bunch of pizzas and bottles of water and took us to the waiting room, where each passenger was then questioned by FBI agents. There was a lot of uneasiness among the passengers, and nerves were still exacerbated, but fortunately the officials were quite friendly. I guess they finally figured out that the guy had no associates on board, which was a relief for us as well, as we were then taken back to our plane after that. After the security officers had meticulously searched him and also every passenger, we were finally allowed to make a phone call, and the first person I called was my mom, and when I spoke to her, she was completely hysterical. It turns out that she and the rest of the family had been watching the news all day, and it turned out that the guy on the plane was an Islamic extremist who had tried to blow up our flight with a bomb he had smuggled on board inside the small koala bag he was carrying, the same bag I had seen the stewardess carry carefully to the back of the plane. My mother was much more informed than I was about what had happened, as none of the passengers on the plane had any idea what was going on, or rather the certainty, because I am sure that several, as well as my cousin and I, had suspected that it was something similar. It was evident from the heavy security deployment around our flight. However, when my mother finally confirmed it to me, it was a very strange feeling. Up to this point, my cousin, My aunt and I had actually remained fairly calm, considering the circumstances. We were more upset about the inconvenience of our travel itinerary and the crazy experience on that plane at this point. But now that I was fully aware of how close we came to having been the new fatalities of a terrorist attack, a new sense of unease and fear came over me. But I felt very grateful to be alive and to have the opportunity to see my mom again and hug her at Christmas. After that, we finally boarded the flight and headed back to Orlando to meet up with the rest of the family. We later learned that this terrorist had actually tried to board the same flight the day before. He was stopped and questioned by a security ring because of the many red flags he had. He had no luggage and bought a one-way ticket with cash, which caused him to miss his flight, but instead of being stopped, he was put on our flight the next day. In 2016, I embarked on a trip to Bombay, India. This was a place I had wanted to see all my life. I had been backpacking in different parts of the world for a few years now, but this particular destination was one of the ones I was most excited about. At first, my plan was mainly to enjoy the gastronomy, the most emblematic tourist places like the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus and Marine Drive. I was also interested in learning more about their culture and customs, since this is a country known for its mysticism. But instead, the destination had prepared something completely different than what I expected, and more than a mystical experience. I ended up embarking on an adventure that would take me to a psychic experience that transcended time and space. It all started on a typical sweltering and humid afternoon in Bombay. I was wandering the streets of Colaba, surrounded by a lot of people and seeing flashy stores everywhere. I had spent most of the day visiting historical monuments like the India Gate and Taj Mahal Palace Hotel. Now I was walking along the famous Colaba Causeway, the city's most famous shopping street, a bustling place full of stores. As I walked along, I saw a lot of colorful posters hanging everywhere. Most of them were in Indian, so I was just going by the pictures. Most of them were advertisements of stores and entertainment offers, but suddenly, an old worn-out poster caught my attention. It mentioned the rumor of a ghost bus, a mysterious bus that traveled the city limits in the dark of night, carrying both living and dead souls. I knew it was surely an urban legend, and possibly that sign was there to arouse the curiosity of tourists. And the truth is that it worked for me, because I immediately wanted to know more. Following the legend's indications, I arrived at an old station located at the edge of the city. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was that this place was far away from the hustle and bustle of downtown Bombay. The stop was completely alone and looked somewhat deserted, with only a few streetlights dimly illuminating the deserted platform. I stood there and waited for the legendary bus, while smoking a cigarette. The place was so lonely and quiet, minutes seemed like hours, and so far nothing had passed by but a couple of motorcycles and about 2 or 3 people on foot. I wanted to wait a few minutes to see if the bus would pass by. I imagined that it was some kind of attraction to give tourists a different experience, as a way to show visitors something of their urban legends, a bit like when you go to a witch's house, something like that I imagined, and it seemed interesting. About half an hour went by and still nothing was happening, and there didn't seem to be any other tourists interested in that experience either, because so far the only one at that stop was me. At one point I decided it was time to leave, so I took the last puff of my cigarette, threw it on the ground and stepped on it with my sandals, but when I was about to walk back to the hotel, what do you think? An old double-decker bus slowly emerged from the fog in the distance. Its bodywork looked rusty, it had no license plate number, and its lights were very dim. It truly gave a ghostly appearance, as if it had traveled from another era. I couldn't see who was inside either, not even the driver, as it was so dark. The bus stopped at my stop, and at that moment I hesitated a bit, because I was starting to feel shivers. But finally I decided to board it. I wanted to know what this was all about. As I boarded, I noticed that all the seats were unoccupied. The bus was completely empty and dimly lit, giving it an indescribably gloomy atmosphere. The driver was an older man who was dressed in an old uniform, and he didn't even look at me. He simply put the vehicle in gear and left the station in complete silence and in an unknown direction. I hadn't even finished settling into the seat when I was already feeling a bit sorry for what I had done, Because if the intention was to be scary, at least with me it was working. As we drove deeper into the desolate streets of the city limits, through the window the landscape became more and more desolate. There seemed to be almost no one around these parts, and the fleeting shadows that passed occasionally seemed to whisper untold stories. There was something a bit oppressive in that silence, but it also felt peaceful, a mixture of sensations that I can hardly describe in words. Suddenly the bus stopped abruptly in front of an old crematorium in an industrial area, and the doors opened automatically, so I got off the bus along with other passengers who emerged from somewhere or got on the bus without me noticing. I felt a little better that I was not the only one embarking on that experience. However, they remained silent and their faces seemed expressionless. They didn't look like tourists either, but more like natives by the features. Once we all disembarked, the passengers started walking directly towards the ruins of the old crematorium, and I followed them as they walked along a path covered with weeds. Finally, we arrived at a building that appeared to have been abandoned for many years. The entire interior was covered in dust and cobwebs, and every step we took echoed throughout the building as if awakening a dormant history deep within the place. Since I got on the bus, I began to feel a little dizzy, a very, very slight feeling of vertigo which was now starting to become more noticeable. I was starting to feel like in a kind of limbo, like when you are in the sea and you let the waves take you. Only it was not my body that felt like that, but my mind. Now we found ourselves in an old warehouse with a broken TV and dots of snow flickering on the blacked-out screen. I was a little puzzled and curious at the same time, as that other feeling I described to you made those dots seem to meander. We stared at that old television screen for I don't know how long, until at one point it suddenly lit up and the image of a woman dressed in clothes from another era appeared. Her face conveyed a deep sadness that seemed to go beyond an act. Through the screen, this woman began to tell us an ancient story of love, betrayal, and sacrifice. But as the story unfolded, the temperature around us began to drop drastically. Suddenly it was almost freezing cold and the air became heavy. Then I could feel those fragments of the past intertwining with reality, and I could almost feel their pain on my own skin. When the woman finished her story, the image gradually faded away until it disappeared, and at that very moment, the passengers who were around me and who had accompanied me all the way began to slowly fade away, as if they had never existed. At that moment I had a kind of revelation. I realized out of the blue that these people were actually the souls of the deceased of the city, who used this ghost bus to relive their stories every night in search of solace, or a chance to be remembered. At the very moment this thought came to my mind, suddenly everything was extinguished. That is, that mystic atmosphere that I had felt since I was getting on the bus, the feeling of dizziness, the temperature of the place, the silence, the television, the passengers, everything was gone. Now I looked around, and I was in the ruins of this old building, all alone and with no idea where I was. I ran out of the place and back to the street, but the bus was no longer there. I stopped under the night breeze, contemplating the illuminated city in the distance, bewildered, and with a heart full of contradictory emotions. This unexpected encounter had revealed to me a completely unknown side of Bombay, a ghostly world where truly the souls of the departed pierce the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead to tell their stories, perhaps for the purpose of finding redemption. That night I walked through the streets of Bombay until I reached my hotel, and as I did so, I could no longer look at the city in the same way. Every face I saw, every person I passed reminded me of those souls I had met, and I could not believe the experience I had just had. The next day, I looked up information about that old industrial area on the internet and discovered that it had been a famous film shooting location where decades earlier a fire broke out that caused the death of several crew members, including a young actress. Her story surprisingly matched the images I had seen on the ghost TV, and the cause of that fire remains a mystery to this day. Since then, my exploration of Bombay stopped focusing on the tourist sites, entertainment, and surface glitz, and focused more on the stories behind the hustle and bustle of the city, the lights, and the flashy places. I spent about 9 days in that fantastic city, met many people, visited many places, and lived incredible experiences. but this one became the most memorable memory of my trip to Bombay. Although it is something I almost never talk about. In fact, I only told it to my wife, whom I met a year later. And now to you. Hi, my name is Eddie, and I'm a native of the United States, but my grandparents are from Scotland, so my family loves to vacation there, and my grandparents even have a nice cabin in the woods that we can all use whenever we want. In 2015, when I was about 17, I went there with my dad and my older brother in the summer, and we spent 15 days in that cabin, in what Dad called a man's trip, although this didn't make my sister, who wanted to come, but this time it was her turn to stay at home. Very happy. The truth is that it was a wonderful experience, and we had a great time for the most part, except for one incident that almost made me pee my pants. I must say that the Scottish forest is a place we go to disconnect, enjoy nature, and escape from the hustle and bustle of the city, and a little bit of the day-to-day responsibilities as well. Since we were little, our father instilled in my brothers and I a love of nature and outdoor activities. So when we're there, we love to hike, canoe, forage for mushrooms, sit by the fireplace at night, that sort of thing. It's not a completely isolated place. There are towns and farms here and there, but it's definitely very rural. If you want to, you can go for days without running into anyone. Personally, I've always liked exploring on my own, discovering new trails through the woods, updating our old maps to better reflect the landscape as it is now. This has always seemed important to me, as the maps sold of the area haven't been updated in years, and many trails no longer exist because nature has reclaimed them. But what I like most is to explore abandoned buildings, and rural Scotland is perfect for that, because in the 19th century, people in the Scottish countryside were very poor. So many emigrated in search of a better life, leaving their properties behind. That's why you can still find many ruins of old farms that were abandoned and nobody else occupied them, even whole small villages. In fact, in my explorations, I have even come across rusted farm tools from over 100 years ago. It's crazy, but it's also fascinating. However, rural depopulation here is not a phenomenon of the last century. Even today, Scotland, like many other countries in the region, has seen its young and middle-aged people leaving the fields for the cities. It is the elderly mostly who stay until they die, and no one buys their houses, so they are simply abandoned. This is very, very common. Then there are the people like my grandparents who live in another country, but have a property there, even if they don't live there. The truth is that you can find many empty houses in the forest, and I love to sneak into them. Most of these houses have already been ransacked, probably by hunters, loggers, or hikers, but sometimes you can still find interesting things, and I really like the fact that I don't have to worry about being seen, because it is really very rare to meet someone in those woods. So one day that fall, I grabbed one of our bikes, which can never be missed on these trips, a map, because GPS doesn't work very well in those parts, my cell phone, and some food and drink, and told my father and brother that I would be back by nightfall at the latest. Then I set off to do my thing. On the map, I had mapped out a circular route that, in theory, would take me about 3 hours if the roads were clear and I didn't stop to explore here and there. But even if I dawdled a bit, I figured I'd still have plenty of time to get back to the cabin before dark. I had a great time at first, pedaling along the forest roads and trails, finding ruins of old buildings, some subway cellars that were incredibly intact, and I was even able to find some mushrooms. Unfortunately, I had some little problems with the map, because as I told you, many of the roads that appear no longer exist, so I had to backtrack several times, but overall I had a pretty good idea of where I was. Of course, this made the whole thing take longer than I had anticipated, so by the time I got to the furthest point of the route and got onto a narrow trail that, according to the map, would take me back in about an hour, the sun was already setting, and this made me a little uneasy. I didn't want to be pedaling in the woods at night. Besides, I was sure Dad would be very worried, and here I didn't have a good signal on my cell phone. Now, because of my bad planning, I was also worried that I couldn't trust the map, even less than I already thought, but I had no choice but to go back in those conditions. Just before entering that trail, I came across some traps in the forest that had given me a good scare. They were two large cages, each with a platform in the center connected to a steel door. On these platforms were the remains of decomposing animals, a bait that no one had touched. I grabbed a stick and disarmed the traps by pushing the platform through the bars, but when the doors slammed shut, the noise was so loud it startled me. Then I realized how quiet everything had become. As I trudged along the uneven terrain and the sun was setting, I began to get that uneasy feeling that everything around me was conscious, somehow. It wasn't exactly the feeling of being watched, not yet, but I felt I had to try not to make noise. It's amazing how human instinct is able to detect any minute detail when there is a threat nearby, even without being aware of it. I kept pedaling along the trail as the sun offered its last rays of light, and after a while, I came to a fork in a clearer area, where I was supposed to continue on a straight path. The trees here were lower, and I guessed it was one of those clearings created by a severe storm that passed through about 7 or 8 years ago. Just at the intersection, there was a small wooden building, a cabin, but a very small one with no windows, almost like a shed. When I started my tour that day, originally my plan was to find abandoned houses, as up to that point I had only seen a couple of stone foundations and a root cellar. So even though by that point I should have been hurrying back, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see if the cabin was locked and if I could take a look inside. I walked over and looked toward the door, saw that it wasn't locked but it was just stuck in the frame, so I pushed it a little and peeked in. Inside, there was a kind of cot, a small kitchen, a very small oven. But then I saw something that made me freeze, an absurd and creepy amount of stuffed animals, more than I would have imagined could fit in that small space. They were everywhere, on the cot, in the oven, nailed to the ceiling, on the walls. The whole inside of the hut was covered with layers and layers of black mold. It was so much that in some of the animals it was no longer possible to distinguish what they had been in life, while in others, I could only guess by the shape. They all looked monstrous. They were covered in that foul substance and the smell of rot and mold was unbearable. I tried to close the door quickly, but the wood had warped so much that it was impossible. So I left it ajar and got the hell out of there. But I had barely gone a few meters away from the cabin when I felt strange. This time I really felt that I was being watched. An absurd thought kept repeating itself in my head. You should have closed the door, you should have closed the door. I don't know why, but the thought of having left that cabin open made me too uneasy. I tried to reason with myself. Calm down, Eddie, you're being really dumb, why the hell would it matter? But not for all the self-therapy in the world would the feeling go away. About 10 minutes later, the road entered an older forest with much taller trees. By this time the sun was already waving goodbye and the horizon was tinged orange under the spruce branches. Darkness was fast approaching, so I checked my cell phone to let my dad know I would be late. But, as expected, I had no reception. A few more minutes passed as I pedaled through the growing darkness, and at that point the road disappeared completely. By that point I had only two options: try to ride the bike forward until I found a forest road on the other side of the forest that would take me back, or turn around, ride back past the creepy cabin, and head back the way I had come. The second option was out of the question. As I said, I'd had to improvise and detour several times to get there because the map was so unreliable, so going back the same way in the dark would be crazy, and all I'd accomplish would be to get lost. But most of all, I didn't want to go through that cabin again. I had a very bad feeling about it. It was irrational, but something told me that I should never go back to that place. At that moment I looked back as twilight was spreading through the forest. Paranoia was taking hold of me. I had an unsettling feeling that I had disturbed something in there by leaving the door open, and that something had come out of that cabin and was following me. I knew it was absurd, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Passing back through the cabin, the traps and the ruins of the old town, and then crossing the clearing of the cellar in the dark, with the feeling that something was chasing me, was impossible. There was no way I was going back that way. Yes, I might get lost trying to get through the forest ahead of me, and I would have to push the bike, and even have to carry it in some sections. But the forest didn't seem to extend too far ahead, only to the sides, so it seemed the only possible option. At that point, I just hoped that the supposed forest road on the other side still existed. Fortunately, after going through some bushes, I found what I assumed were the remains of the old road, because the ground was a bit more sunken there. I tried to follow it until I came upon another set of ruins, the foundations of some farmhouse probably. Behind that, the ground descended into a marshy area with birch trees that looked white in the gloom. I stopped to listen, but still didn't want to turn around. I heard nothing. The forest was strangely silent at that moment, but the horrible feeling of being watched, of being followed, only increased until in a moment, I felt that not only was something behind me, but that the forest itself was aware of my presence, listening, perhaps even watching, as if deliberately silent. Fear paralyzed me. I didn't even try to rationalize it. I simply accepted that this was what was happening. I could feel that dark presence, that oppressive energy right behind me. But I refused to look. Instead, I rummaged through my backpack and pulled out what food I had left: a sandwich, some gingerbread cookies, and the mushrooms I had picked earlier. I placed them all on a stone on one of the old walls surrounding the ruins, and without turning around, said something like, Please let me go. I'm so sorry. I won't come back here, I promise. Just let me go home." I was almost shaking, and these words came out of my mouth like a whisper. After that, I grabbed my bike and started walking towards the swamp. And as I did, I could feel that whatever was behind me, it didn't follow me. I could only feel it watching me. I rode into the swamp without looking back. Fortunately, it wasn't a big swamp, just a wet stretch of about 200 meters until the ground went up again. Even so, it took me quite a while to cross it, as I had to push and carry the bike in turns, because I couldn't avoid getting into mud puddles and getting stuck. By the time I came out on the other side, I was drenched in sweat, and my feet were covered in mud up to mid-calf. I kept stopping often to listen for any sound behind me, but there was nothing left. And then, believe it or not, the trees opened up and there was the logging road. I could have cried tears of joy and relief at that moment. Without thinking too much, I entered the road, and it was only then that I finally turned to look back. But I couldn't even see the swamp between the trees anymore because everything was completely dark. Luckily, there was some moonlight and the bike light was working too, so I hopped on and pedaled home as fast as I could. When I arrived, my father was very worried and was getting ready to go out to look for me together with my brother. Fortunately, I arrived just in time. My father asked me about what had happened, and I just told him that I got lost. I didn't want to tell him what else my brother would make fun of me, thinking that I had just panicked. But I know it was real. I never knew what it was that haunted me in the forest, and I may never know. But what I think happened is that by showing respect, by leaving my food as an offering, that forest spirit or whatever it was, just spared my life, so to speak, and let me out. In 2019, before all the COVID-19 chaos happened, I traveled with my family to Morocco. This was my parents' gift for my 15th birthday, as my best friend had gone with her parents the year before and raved about her experience there, so I asked my parents, instead of throwing me a party, to gift me the trip to Morocco. They were more than thrilled, as it was not too expensive a destination, and we would all enjoy the experience. We stayed in a very nice hotel in Marrakesh for a week, and after visiting several amazing places, on the second day we decided to explore the city with a guided tour, which is the best option when you are going somewhere for the first time. The group visited several fascinating places, such as the famous Jama El Fna Square, the Bahia Palace, and the Majorelle Gardens. And the last stop was the local market, where you could buy souvenirs and knockoff items from well-known brands at crazy prices. My mother and I were looking at some very nice bags, when suddenly I saw one that caught my attention very much. Then a salesman came up and started promoting it, saying that the material was exactly the same as the real thing and all that, you know. They are very good at selling. I asked my mother if she would buy it for me, but she said we would come back later, after we had a look at the other stores, to make sure there wasn't another one I liked better. As we walked around the market, I looked at other items, But I didn't change my mind about this gorgeous fake Gucci bag that was a beauty. And the truth is that it did look a lot like the original. It would probably shatter in a rooster crow. But I wanted it anyway. When there were about 15 minutes left for our time in the market to end, we decided to go back to the store where the bag I wanted was. We went in there and I noticed that the bag was no longer in the same place. At that moment, my brother texted my mom to help him with, I don't know what. The thing is that my mom left the store, and I was left waiting for the salesman to finish serving someone else to ask him about the bag. When he finally came to me, I asked him if they still had that particular bag. He told me that he had just sold it, that model sold like hotcakes because it was very fashionable and all the girls wanted it. He told me he wasn't sure, but he would take a look in the back room. There was a small door next to the cash register that the salesman opened. It appeared to be a small storage room with various items that I guess he was planning to sell, so he told me to follow him there, as that was where he kept the rest of the bags. My parents had warned me about stranger danger since I was a little girl, especially when I was in a foreign country. However, against my better judgment, I decided to follow him into the back room. He went in first, and once inside, he opened the door to let me in, saying that if they still had that bag I wanted, it would be on the other side of the room. I walked in without a second thought, and as soon as I did, he slammed the door shut behind me and swung the deadbolt, leaving me plunged into total darkness. Suddenly, I realized what had just happened and started banging on the door and yelling at him to let me out. He yelled at me that if I didn't stop yelling and making noise, he would do horrible things to me. The threats he said to me still turn my stomach every time I remember them. They were such horrible things I'd rather not say them. However, that didn't stop me. I continued banging on the door and screaming, calling my parents. Man, now very angry, pounded on the door from the other side and yelled at me again to shut up. But just as I was beginning to lose all hope, I heard a familiar voice and felt my soul come back to me. It was my dad. My dad was on the other side yelling my name, and then I heard my mom's voice too. They were both calling me, probably very desperate to see that I was nowhere to be found. I yelled back at them as loud as I could, almost breaking my lungs. And I guess they heard me, because what followed next was a loud shouting match between my dad and the salesman. I couldn't understand most of it, but I did understand perfectly the part where my para threatened to punch the guy to death if he didn't open the door and let me out. At that point, there was some silence, and as I was still trapped there, in the middle of the dark and completely terrified, I heard the door open, and the first thing I saw was my parents standing there. My mother with her face drenched in tears and my father with an expression that was somewhere in between fury and terror. I immediately ran into their arms and they both wrapped me in a big hug, all the while telling me how scared they had been and how happy they were that they were able to find me in time. We got out of that place as fast as we could, looked for my brother and went back to the hotel, but before that, as we were coming out of that degenerate store, Daddy gave him a hard punch in the nose that made him fall backwards on a pile of merchandise. To this day, I always wonder what would have happened if my parents hadn't heard my screams. About 5 years ago, when I was 20, my girlfriend and I planned an adventure in the mountains of Montana. She lived nearby and we used to hike together fairly often. Every fall, we would set out on a long trail, sometimes several days, to camp and enjoy nature. In 2019, we decided to cross a mountain range until we reached a small lake at the top. But unfortunately, a few days before the trip, my girlfriend had to cancel due to an emergency at work, and I had already asked for the week off and had everything ready, so I decided to go alone. She agreed and even lent me some of her equipment. On a Saturday morning, I drove to the trailhead and started my route. This wasn't just any recreational trail, the kind you do in a few hours, no. This was a mountain trail with no marked trails, where you had to orient yourself with maps, compass, and landmarks. Normally, there is a landmark in the distance, like a rock formation that you walk towards, and then when you get there, you can see the next one and so on. This is the most effective way to guide yourself in this vast place, where getting lost is very easy. I spent the first 2 days hiking to a ridge in the mountains. It was really arduous, especially since I was alone and had to be very careful at every step, as no one would be there to help me if I made a mistake. When it got dark on the second day, I camped near a creek several hours from the ridge. I set up the tent, built a fire, and warmed some food I had in my backpack. The sun had already set, and it was around 8 o'clock when I got into the tent to rest and read for a while. I left the campfire burning, planning to put it out before going to sleep. After about 20 minutes of reading, through the crackling of the fire, I heard the crackle of a branch snapping behind my tent. I immediately jumped up and became alert. The first thing that came to mind was a black bear. These are plentiful in this area of Montana, and I guessed it might have been attracted to the smell of the food I had cooked earlier. I sharpened my hearing, alert for any other sounds, but heard nothing else for a few minutes. I was really nervous. Black bears can be very territorial and aggressive. They usually avoid human contact, but if they feel you are invading their territory or they consider you a threat, you are in serious trouble. After a few minutes without hearing anything but the fire, I crept out of the tent to make sure there was no threat nearby anyway. I had brought a compressed air horn with me just in case, so I took it out of my bag and kept it handy in case I needed to use it. I shone the flashlight into the tree line and saw nothing. I activated the horn anyway, trying to scare off any predators, but again, dead silence. It was strange because the creaking of the branch had been very clear, as if something had stepped on it. I stood outside the tent for a while, looking around nervously before putting out the campfire and going back inside. I had a hard time falling asleep that night. I was too alert, listening very carefully for any sound. In the morning, almost surprised that I had slept through the night, I packed up my things and continued on my way to the ridge. From there, it was a straight line to the lake, so I picked up the pace. I wanted to get there before dark so I wouldn't have to set up camp again. In the end, I made it with an hour to spare. The lake at the top was beautiful, and definitely the hike had been worth every step. I walked around, enjoying the scenery, and then set up the tent by the tree line, again near the lake. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't help but hear soft noises in the trees behind me. I thought it was my paranoia from the night before, but it was really creepy. It sounded almost like footsteps, but I knew there couldn't be anyone else there. If there was another tent, I would have seen it as I circled the lake. It was too dark to see more than a few feet, so looking around wasn't an option. An hour later, I got into the tent and finally went to bed. But every few minutes I heard the footsteps again. They were too soft to distinguish clearly, but they kept me on edge. Finally, exhaustion got the better of me and I fell asleep. I think it was only an hour later when I was startled awake by the sound of someone running near my tent. I jumped out of bed immediately, grabbed the flashlight and bolted. That's when I saw a bare back moving away in the distance. My heart was pounding a mile a minute. I looked down at the ground and saw footprints around my tent as if someone had been walking around me, surveying the camp. I tried to rekindle the campfire as quickly as possible to get a better look. I was totally terrified. I had nowhere to go and no one to ask for help. I sat by the fire all night, looking around constantly, feeling very nervous and scared. I was alone at the time and had nothing to defend myself with. Just a small pocket knife that I kept in my hand the whole time, and the air horn, which might work for a bear, but not for someone coming to attack me. My heart hammered in my ears all night long, as I kept vigil, paying attention to even the slightest sound and looking around me every moment. But fortunately, I didn't see or hear anything again. So after a few hours, when it was about to get light, I decided to go into the tent and get some sleep. When I woke up, it was already mid-morning. I took some pictures of the lake and started my way back. I had planned to stay a whole day, but I no longer felt safe. I had the feeling that I was being followed. Fortunately, I made it back without further incident. But along the way, I began to notice that several things were missing from my backpack: food, some tools, small things. This was really disturbing because I always had my bag with me. This means that whoever was outside my tent that night at some point snuck inside and stole things from my bag. Every time I think about it, I get chills, because if that person had wanted to murder me in my sleep or harm me in any way, they would have done it with no problem. That was the last time I camped alone. 5 years ago, I was in the middle of a road trip from Wisconsin to the beaches of Florida, something I had wanted to do for years. I had recently acquired a new car and thought there would be no better time to finally realize this teenage dream. I had been behind the wheel for days, eating up the miles, as well as the beautiful scenery that changed from city to city around me, with the excitement of the vacation at its peak. But that night, exhaustion knocked me down. I needed a place to sleep, so I booked an Airbnb at the last minute without thinking much about it. I was only going to be there for a few hours. The Airbnb was in the middle of nowhere in Georgia, far from the highway. It was an ordinary house surrounded by trees and with a porch that invited to take a nap. But when I opened the door, what a stink. It smelled musty, dusty, and something else that I could not describe, as if a bug had died in some lost corner of the house. Although I was dead tired, the smell made me wrinkle my nose. I took a quick look around, but the living room was half dark. With old, rickety furniture in the bedroom, down the hall seemed even worse. The smell there was unbearable. No way was I going to sleep in that room. I left my backpack in the living room and prepared to sleep on the couch. At least there I could breathe. I grabbed a blanket from one of the chairs and put it on the couch, but just then, a loud bang echoed off the walls. I was more confused than scared because it was too loud to be just the house settling or something. The sound echoed in such a way that it was hard to tell where exactly it was coming from. So I walked down the hallway and looked in every room, searching for something out of the ordinary, but everything seemed fine. I didn't quite know what to look for, but from what I could see, there was nothing to worry about, at least for the short stay I was going to have there. Since I didn't find anything unusual, beyond the bad smell, I went back to the couch and continued getting ready for sleep. After laying out the blankets, I lay down on the furniture and pulled out my cell phone to plan the next few days. But then I heard another knock, and a few seconds after the first knock, there was another one almost identical to the previous one, echoing off all the walls. I jumped up and went back down the hallway, but this time I decided to check the rooms more thoroughly. I turned on the lights and examined the walls and ceiling, but found nothing suspicious. I started to think that maybe a large branch was swaying in the wind and hitting the roof, but even that seemed unlikely because there were indeed trees around, but none seemed to be that close to the house. After wandering the hallway and finding nothing again, I went back to the couch and reminded myself that I was only there for one night, and whatever trouble there was none of my business. So I turned out the lights, lay down, and fell asleep. I was so tired that I had no trouble falling asleep, but the way I woke up was most unusual. My eyes were still closed, and I was half asleep and half awake. I probably wouldn't even remember it if it weren't for what happened next. I opened my eyes and felt a chill in my stomach. A man was standing right above me, staring at me. My body tensed all over, but only for a split second, before the man scurried off to the side of the couch and disappeared out the front door. I jumped up and ran after him to see where he was going, but lost sight of him in the trees. I immediately closed the door and went to get my phone, but stopped dead in my tracks at the end of the hallway when I saw what was there. Hanging in the middle of the hallway was a folding ladder leading to the attic. I wasted no more time. It was obvious that the man had been in the attic that night, so I went up to investigate. When I got upstairs, I saw that there wasn't too much in that place to indicate that this man had been there for more than a day or two. He was probably just using the Airbnb as a place to stay. Obviously, I had no idea who this man was, but what happened made me very uneasy. What was he doing almost on top of me, looking at me like that? Why didn't he just run away? I have no idea what his intentions were, but I'm sure they weren't good. I just didn't count on waking up suddenly and catching him there. After the incident, I made sure to close the doors and windows very tightly. But I still couldn't sleep a wink, so I had to drive the next day almost completely late at night. Fortunately, the rest of the trip went well and I was able to get to Florida without any major setbacks. But without a doubt, this experience was very disturbing and almost ruined my dream trip.